All right, so hello and welcome everyone to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from MSDynamicsWorld.com. I'm joined by Andy Snook, CEO of Fastpath, for a new session in the Dynamics GRC Day online series. Today's event is all about business process mapping and how it impacts dynamic systems. So as we get started, please know that you can add your feedback and ask questions using the Q&A block you should see to the right of the main presentation window. I know Andy will be leaving time at the end for questions. Also, be on the lookout for the media viewer block if you want to ask for an offline follow-up. You can just use that block to make a quick request. So with that, why don't we move on to the main event. Please allow me to welcome Andy Snook to get things started. Andy, let me just make sure your line is open.
There we go. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon to you. Jason, thanks for the kind introduction. Again, my name is Andy Snook. I work at Fastpath in Des Moines, Iowa, in our development center. Just a little bit about me. I always think it's helpful to understand, the audience you're talking to and as well as who's presenting. I have over 18 years experience in designing, implementing financial systems. So I started off working for EY, working in the SAP practice, implementing SAP, and then I moved on to implementing Microsoft Dynamics, both on the ERP side as well as on the CRM side. For the last 12 years, we've been working specifically on systems auditing, so security audit, regulatory compliance around those areas. And then I'm also certified in risk and information systems control. So really a lot of deep experience in terms of taking a business process and taking that process and being able to translate that into an application, and then also incorporating a lot of the considerations around risk, the repeatability of the process, the reliability of that process. So this is kind of something that I've always enjoyed talking about, because most of the failures I see in implementations, as well as most of the time I see failures when people are going through their audits, what would have really helped them is if they would have started with a roadmap, right? Started with that business process. So it was always something we encouraged clients to do when we were doing systems implementation, but at the same time, it was usually the first place where people would push back, because it does take a lot of time. It does take a lot of energy to accomplish building those business processes. But as we walk through, we're going to learn and understand why it's important, and then also kind of help you understand how you can take this back into your own environment and sell your team on the idea of the value of it and why you should be taking this on, right? So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what are process maps. We're going to talk about why they're important. We'll talk about the different benefits and uses of the process maps. So I kind of already touched on a few of those, but there are several different uses for them. We'll talk about how to conduct a process mapping workshop back in your office, right? So when we do this session in person at GRC Day, we actually physically walk through the entire room and do an exercise so you can learn. So one of the things that's always important to me as a presenter is that you can take something away back to your job, back to maybe your personal life, and implement something right away, right? So you should be able to do something new, learn something new, and actually act on that. So that'll be the hope for today. And we'll talk a little bit about who you need to invite to a business process mapping workshop, and then kind of what are the tools that you need to have a successful experience. So again, we kind of want to tee that up, that if, when you come back from lunch today, if you wanted to go sit down and do a business process mapping, even by yourself, this would be something that you can accomplish in your own job. So we usually have a lesson with Legos. And the first lesson I learned about Legos is it's Lego and not Legos. It's not plural. But when we do this session in person, what I like to do is there's this exercise where we give everyone a set of Legos. And half the room gets the box with the picture, right, of what you're supposed to be building and the instructions. And the other half of the room just gets a Ziploc bag full of Legos. And the lesson, obviously, is things are much easier to do when you have instructions or what it's supposed to look like in the end, right? And so very quickly when you go through this exercise, usually within the first 30 seconds, somebody will raise their hand and say, hey, can I get a copy of the instructions? And then very quickly it becomes, hey, this isn't fair, because we make it into a contest. The first person to finish the project typically gets a bottle of whiskey or gets a gift card, whatever it may be. Somebody says this isn't fair. How am I supposed to be able to accomplish putting these Legos together without any sort of directions, right? If I'm supposed to meet a specific goal at the end, but I don't even know what that goal looks like. And so the lesson is readily obvious, right? It's much easier to accomplish a task, accomplish a goal, if you have those instructions. It's a lot easier to know if you know what it's supposed to look like at the end. It's a lot easier to accomplish that. The other lesson there is that it's much easier to do it again and again and again if you have those instructions. It's a repeatable process, right? So in auditing, we talk a lot about a reliable, repeatable process, right, that you can do the same thing every time. Well, you want to do that in your business as well, not just when you're playing with children's toys at work, but you'd also want to be able to do that when you're going through a purchasing process, when you're going through month-end close, because you want to avoid errors. You want to avoid having to stay at work for, month-end close. Everybody's at work for 100 hours a week because something always changes. So the more consistent you can be, maybe the more time you can get back in the day. So you avoid errors, you avoid churn in that process. So really what we want to do in building a business process is the same thing that the wonderful people at Lego did, was build the instructions. Now, some of you may be like me, and it's the idea that I don't even like the instructions with Legos. I'd rather just build whatever I want. Well, for those people, go home and buy a box of Lego. Don't try to do that with your purchase order processing or your month-end close at work. There are other ways to express your creativity, right? So really that lesson, I know we didn't give out Legos. If somebody wants Legos, you can email me and I'll send you some Legos. But the idea, again, is the reason I kind of let this slide in here was because it is a very, and it's something, this is something you could do with your team. You go buy bags of Legos at Super Target for like $2 and kind of push them through that lesson. So if you are having a problem with month-end close or your RMA processing or whatever it may be, and you want to push this whole project forward of developing a business process map, it's actually, on your Monday meeting or a team meeting, go through that exercise. It's kind of fun. Everybody gets some Legos at the end, and at the same time, you're helping prove that point that it would be much easier if we had instructions to go through that. So what is a process, right? So a process is just a set of steps or that result in a set of instructions on how we get from point A to point B, right? How do we go through a process? So this is one of my favorite Far Side cartoons, that his process in the morning, he obviously was struggling with his process, even if it's only a two-step process, but he was struggling with that in terms of maybe he was putting on his shoes some mornings instead of his pants and then was having a hard time getting his pants on over his shoes, or maybe it was one shoe, whatever it may be. But again, a process is just that order of operations of how we're going to get from point A to point B and accomplish some goal, right? So we want to document that some way, so that my mind is always, let's document this so no matter who comes into the organization or who comes into our department, if we hire somebody new, if they transfer in, they would be able to walk through that process and understand what they're supposed to be doing very easily. It isn't something that only if you've worked here for 20 years do you know how things work, right? So what are process maps? A visual representation of a set of roles, steps, decisions, and systems that lead to an outcome, right? It's a standardization of how things are done at a company. And I think a couple of those things are really key points. A lot of times you'll see that people just have steps in their process, right? Customer places an order, we put the invoice into the system, customer pays the invoice, and then we ship out the product. That's the process. Well, I highly doubt that's really how every single time that process works, right? Maybe does the customer pay by a credit card? Does the customer pay with cash? Do they pay, do you give them payment terms? Do they fail a credit check? What actually are some of those decisions? So that not only is it the steps, but it's the decisions along the way, right? What types of things could happen? along the way, and then what are our different alternatives based on those decisions. If-then kind of decisions that happen. And those are those nuances that are going to help somebody that comes in from a different department or a new hire be able to walk through that process and not constantly being at your desk saying, hey, what if this happens, right? In terms of when you're implementing an ERP and you're trying to standardize something in Dynamics, right, for your purchasing process or your sales order entry, you want to make sure that you catch every possible thing that may happen at your organization, right? And every business rule that might happen at your organization. Does the customer request a price change, a unit price change after something has gone from order to invoice? Are you going to allow that? Do you have to create a whole new order? Does it take you back to the beginning? Go directly to jail, do not pass go kind of thing. So those decisions are important as well. And sometimes we see that it's just a very vanilla, straightforward thing, that things always work out perfectly at our organization. And I've never worked in a place where anything works in a straight line, right? It doesn't work that way. The other one that companies typically will sometimes miss or not have as much, pay enough attention to is the roles, right? What role performs the steps within this function? So is there a salesperson? Is it an order entry clerk? Does it go to a finance clerk? What are the roles that maybe a system administrator has to get involved? Every single time we do a contract over this amount, we have to get a system administrator involved for something. And you want to make sure that you identify every single role or person that's involved. It's a role, not a person, but every role that's involved in that process, because that's really going to help you from a Dynamics perspective. That can help you with your training. How do I train that new hire? It can also help them, the collaboration, knowing that they're going to have to work with other departments and who to go contact in other departments. It also gives everybody visibility of how that process works. And then finally, it helps you set up your application security inside of Dynamics, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. And then the last one is systems, right? I would imagine that there's not a company on this call that the only piece of enterprise software that you use is Microsoft Dynamics, right? That's it. We don't use any banking software. We don't use a CRM package. We don't use we don't use email. We don't use Excel. That there are systems that are all integrated together, or that are a part of the process. And it's how do those systems end up talking to each other inside of that process? Where are the risks inside of those integrations? And starting to understand the visibility across. So things like, well, we brought down CRM today because the sales we needed to upload a bunch of new leads into the system, whatever it may be. But you don't realize that if we take down the CRM system, it's going to have an impact on month-end close because we're pulling data from that, right? You can't just reboot that server, right? Because if you do that, it has an impact somewhere else down the line. So making sure that you understand what are all those key systems, that'll also, from a GRC perspective, start to help you identify where are the risks and where are the systems that should fall into scope when we're doing our audits. So it's not just a set of, we go from this box to that box to that box, and that's what happens. It's kind of like reading instructions sometimes on I think about the instructions on how to install a ceiling fan, right? And they're like, oh, okay, well, you do this, you do step 1, step 2, and step 3, and during step 1, invariably, I take apart the old ceiling fan, and the box up there in the ceiling looks nothing like what's in the directions, right? And my wires aren't white, green, and black. They're purple and green and white striped and orange. Well, what do I do? I'm not sure how this works. I'm already off the process. But the person putting the instructions in the box just assumed that every house was going to be the same. So again, it's being able to have those different options as you go through a process and helping as much as possible, right? So in that example, you can't account for every little thing. There is a point of diminishing return with some of the cases that you handle, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're trying to drive through those decisions as you're talking about it. So if I flip to the next slide here, why is the process mapping important, right? How do you sell this internally at your own organization? So a picture is worth 1,000 words, back to our Lego example, right? It's a lot, even if I don't have the step-by-step instructions, if I can just see a picture of what I'm supposed to end up with, right? If I have a pile full of Lego and I say, is this supposed to be a plane, a race car, a motorcycle? What is this supposed to be? I have no idea, and I could make this into a lot of different things. Or if I know at the end I'm supposed to have a fire truck, well, I can probably make a reasonable facsimile of the fire truck, right? So even just walking through that picture, most auditors will tell you, like most companies have the old narratives that they've written up for their business processes. Now, most auditors want to see those process flows. It's much easier for them to follow the process flow than it is for them to read through the narrative, right? Walking through those pictures is much easier. Most of the kids' toys that you get, and talk a lot about kids' toys, I guess you can tell that we have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, but when you get a kid's toy, they don't even have English descriptions of how to put the toy together. They just have the picture, right, of how do I get from step one to having the toy at the end, right? So the other thing you can do is you can increase productivity. If I put 50 people in a room with 1,000 boxes of Legos with the instructions, I'm probably going to make those fire trucks a lot faster than putting 1,000 people in the room with 1,000 boxes of Legos with no instructions, right? So if we don't know what we're doing, you can throw as many people at it as you want, right? So you're going to increase that productivity if people know what they're supposed to be doing. One, it's easier to follow the process, right? Two, you're going to have less churn in terms of somebody coming back to your desk and saying, you know, somebody's trying to pay me with a Discover card. What do I do with this? Or somebody wants me to fax them a purchase order. Do we even have a fax machine? And in the process, it's, hey, we don't fax that out, right? That's a rule, whatever it may be. So you have less churn and less questions internally. You stop hiring more and more people. If your month-end close takes, 4 people or the entire department 3 weeks, it might not be that you need to hire 5 more people. It might be that you need a better process, right? So again, it's a matter of putting that process in place is going to help people be more productive at work. It decreases waste and confusion, kind of covered that before. It's that person, the first day they come into their job, if they can walk through that training and walk through the process, you're not going to waste as much time bringing them up to speed, right? You can identify areas of improvement. Where are some places that we're getting hung up during this process? Why are we still doing this manually? I mean, I think the best example of this in the world is Office Space and the TPS reports, right? Why do we have TPS reports? Nobody even looked, well, we've always filled them out. Well, why do we do that, right? So as you go through and define that map, one of the best examples that I've heard of that is there's a little girl talking to her mom. They're cooking dinner, and the mom cuts both ends off of a ham and throws them away. And the little girl says, Mom, why did you just cut both ends off of that ham? Isn't that a waste? And she's like, I don't know, honey. That's the way your grandma told me to do it. You should go ask your grandma. So the little girl goes to her grandma and says, Grandma, why do we cut both ends off the ham? And the grandma says, well, because the oven was too small. Well, we probably have a new oven. So you're doing things because you've always done it that way. It doesn't mean you should continue to do that. So as you go through these process designs, you might find a lot of things that you could fix, right? So why do we keep faxing things to people if they're just immediately throwing them away? You can also identify risks. And one of the stories I tell all the time is we were going through a business process mapping exercise at a company that probably all of you have heard of, and we were doing the order-to-cash processing. And we got to the point where we were talking about credit card processing, and this was a long time ago. This was still probably in the late 90s, so it wasn't just all automated credit cards. The people were still, calling in, typing in credit cards, things of that nature. PCI compliance wasn't hugely prevalent, so it wasn't like that. It was just starting to come online, right? And so we were talking about customers calling in with their credit cards and how they could pay with a credit card. And we had the systems on our map as well. And as we were sitting in the room, we had team members from the IT department and the development team. We had teams from the finance team and the sales team all in the same room. And they said, oh, yep, we put in the credit card, we type that into Dynamics, we type that into the credit card processor. Once it gets approved, it goes on. And one of the young developers who had probably only been there for about a year said, oh, well, I actually save all those credit card numbers so we can reuse them again and again and it'll go faster. And we all looked at him and said, you do what? He's like, oh, yeah, I have that Access database where I save everybody's name, credit card, expiration date. Really? Do we know where that's at? So somewhere in the building was an Access database that nobody had ever heard of that had everyone's credit card number, every expiration date, but he thought he was doing something helpful, right? This makes customers' lives easier. We're gaining productivity because I can automatically push that back. He didn't understand that there was risk associated with saving all of that information. So it was one of those things that because we had everybody in the same room, we would have never heard about that, and there would have been that Access database sitting around if we wouldn't have gone through the process. So you can identify where the risks are, document those risks, and then start to document some mitigations for that. So it not only helps you maybe streamline a process, but identify where your risks are and maybe where you should be focusing some attention. You can also improve communications between finance and IT. So a lot of times, finance wants to do things one way, IT, you're siloed off. Everybody has their own kingdom, and it's kind of just this request and then hope that the other one gets it done, right? And what a lot of this is building that kind of camaraderie and the partnership between the two to say, you know, we can do a lot of these things better. So things like during the audit is that I request this data from the audit team on the first of every quarter, and then it takes you guys 2 weeks to get the data back to me. Isn't there a way that we could take that out? Is there some technology that we could add that would make it easier to get that information, empower the audit team or the finance team to get that information? Could we talk about that? Or how do we better pull the information? The other thing it helps do is it helps the IT team push back on the finance team to say, hey, if we write this customization, do you realize what it does to the process? Or do you realize that every time you call me with your hair on fire that you want me to give our AR clerks access to create vendors? Do you realize that that wasn't a part of our standard business process? Right, so you can, IT can push back on finance, finance can push back on IT a little bit there, and it gets more of a collaborative environment to say, hey, if we're all agreed on the processes and the systems, we're all on the same page, we're all going at the same goal of the process we agreed upon, and you're trying to break down some of those silos there between the two. So to me, that's why it's important, because you're going to give that consistency. It's going to be a reliable approach, or a repeatable approach, a reliable approach to whatever you do, and it's going to be able to be something that you can pull out later and say, are we doing the things the way we're supposed to be doing it, or if we want to change it, you have that baseline from something that's been agreed upon by all the teams. So this is the risk of not using a process map, right? So my little friend Jeffy, is this Billy or Jeffy? I can never remember which one it is. It could be both as far as I know. I know the girl's name is Dolly and the baby's name. Anyway, so my family circus knowledge is now exposed. But this is, you know, your classic Sunday newspaper cartoon. Some of the people in the crowd, we might have to explain what cartoons are or what a Sunday cartoon section is if they still, or what a newspaper is, right? So one of the things here is Billy's he's going out to play, right? Or maybe he's just walking to his buddy's house, and all the places and how he gets there and everything else. And at the end, he's like, boy, my legs are tired. It's like, well, you could have just walked straight across the street, right? If we knew where we were going, we wouldn't have expended so much energy getting there, right? Or we wouldn't have had so many other challenges. We wouldn't have fallen into the garden, we wouldn't have climbed a tree, all the other distractions, and our month-end close wouldn't have taken so long if we had a definitive process. And this looks kind of silly, but we've heard a lot of stories at GRC Day and from a lot of our clients that this is really what's going on. And over time, it degrades into this, right? Well, it used to be because we had to file the TPS reports for that regulatory compliance. Well, that doesn't exist anymore for us, but yet we're still filing the TPS reports, right? So instead of scaling Humpty's wall, you could cross that out and put in, file your TPS report, right? it's just one of those things where it starts to be really kind of random happening where you ended up at the end, but next time when you do it, next month when you have to go through this process, are you going to be able to repeat those steps, and should you repeat those steps that you just went through? So what are the benefits and uses of the business process maps, right? So how are you going to sell this internally? One is employee training that we talked about. It makes it very easy if you roll out a business process map to anyone, whether an AP clerk, whether it's an IT person, no matter who it is on the team. How do we do things, and why do we do these things, right? So it's a matter of, yes, we file the TPS reports because if we don't, we get fined by the FDA, whatever it is. There's a reason we do this. I know it seems like it doesn't make any sense, but this is why we're doing that, right? So again, if you're documenting the steps, the decisions, and also the risks, you can start educating your employees on what is this risk, right? It's another session topic is creating that risk-based culture, but you want the employees to understand that, hey, we sign off on every single purchase order because we don't want somebody to go out and order 1 million Xboxes and have them show up on the dock in 2 days, and now we have a huge payable to Microsoft, right? So it's explaining the risks to the employees, having them understand what the mitigations to the risks are or how to avoid that. The employee training, think about things like user provisioning. We heard a story, we were at Summit last week, and somebody said, my worst case scenario is us hiring a new employee as an IT person because it takes me forever to get them set up in Dynamics, in the phone system, in Active Directory, in all the other systems. I have to give them access to SharePoint, all these other things that I have to do. It's very difficult for me to do that. So if you have a standard hiring process, which not only includes did they fill out all of their payroll paperwork? Did you give them an access card? Did you give them a chair? Do they know what their phone number is? Did they set up their voicemail? But it's also, did you give them access to Dynamics? And what access did they need? Who requested it? Who approved it? If you can go through those step by step, you're going to, one, make it easier for the end users that have to do it, and two, you're going to avoid lost time from the employee. I'm sure all of us have started a job or started a project somewhere where that first day you're sitting in your chair at your desk going, what am I supposed to do all day, right? They haven't given me access to Dynamics. I was supposed to be an AP clerk, and I'm just kind of sitting here waiting. They're going to take me to my new hire lunch and probably have me read through the employee handbook the rest of the day. So you're losing that employee. That's lost time because you didn't have a new hire process, right? You can also do this from a systems implementation perspective. If you have all of your business processes defined, then when you decide to go from, let's say that you're on Dynamics GP now, and you want to go to Dynamics 365 operations, right? It's going to be much easier to take your business processes and say, this is how we do sales order entry, and go to a new system and be able to walk through those steps of how 365 approaches the world versus the way GP did. So instead of fumbling your way through it, it's like, this is how we want the system to work. This is how it should be configured because it's based on our business rules, not based on the system that we're implementing, right? That was always what SAP said, is, oh, it's based on best practice. You should do it the way we told you to do it. But then everybody went out and said, no, we have our own business process. This is the way we want it configured, right? So it's the same thing. So as you're implementing those systems, as you evolve through time or upgrade and move to different systems, you want to make sure that it matches your business process. That's also going to help you as you start to go through and document any of the changes, or if you add new systems to that. So if you're using, let's say that you're using Dynamics and you want to implement Coupa for your purchasing, you can come in and it's very easy to say, yeah, now I have this cloud product that's a best-of-breed product. I want to use that, but it matches up very well with what we're doing in terms of our purchasing. And it's also easier to write an RFP based on your business processes versus based on narratives are just based on those, horrible RFPs that come out in that grid. When I was responding to RFPs, I would have much rather seen a business process to say, I can walk you through how Dynamics processes a sales order based on what you gave me. I can much easier build a solution demo based on that. So it can help you with that systems implementation. It can also help with the customizations. So if there are a lot of manual steps, right, things like, every month we request the user access from the IT department, the audit team requests user access reports from the IT department, and then the IT department has to print those out. These are all very manual steps, and we want to automate that somehow. So let's build a customization, or let's build a custom report, or build custom functionality, whatever it may be, or you want to build a customization in to prevent users from changing the unit price on an invoice, right? Once we've agreed with the customer that this is their order, we want to make sure that that order gets invoiced correctly because it's what we agreed on. So maybe we're going to write a customization that says we're going to disable that unit price field. But what it does is once you standardize your business process, if you have a business process owner that requests a customization for IT, you can roll out that business process and say, where does this customization live on our business process? And how does this change our business process? Because otherwise, we see companies falling into this trap that they're going to customize everything for whatever reason, even if it doesn't help the business process, right? You're just building customizations for customization's sake. Now, some developers like that, right, because it gives them something to do, but if you're really doing your job from an IT perspective, it all goes back to how is this going to impact the business? The other thing it helps you do is then you can document the customization, who requested the customization, why it's there, and then when you go to upgrade, right, you go back to your testing with that customization and say, this customization didn't come through. We see that happen a lot, that when you upgrade, those customizations may not make it through, or we have to rewrite that customization because it's critical to our business process, right? Or maybe the new software has that functionality natively, and you can take that customization out of the business process. So it's going to help you define the customizations, document the customizations, and then collaborate on the customizations as it relates to the finance team and the IT team. This is also a huge help in end-user security. Fastpath, we help companies implement dynamic security all the time. It's much easier for us to help companies with that if they have business process maps, because we can sit down and say, what does an AP clerk need to do? Okay, they create a vendor, they create an invoice, they update, whatever it may be. Do they create purchase orders? No, that's our purchasing clerk. Do they create payment terms? No, this is that happens in the finance team. So what you start to be able to do is say, if I can understand the steps, all the steps that an AP clerk needs to do through all these processes, then I can start translating what those business process steps are to what the security requirements would be inside of Dynamics, right? So I know what forms they need in GP. I know what menus they need in NAV. I know what tables and duties and privileges they need inside of AX, right? So it's much easier, and it's one reason why people use the LCS tool inside of Dynamics. It helps them understand what people need to be doing in Dynamics. It can also help you understand why other systems as well, not just Dynamics. So if you have Coupa or a banking system or whatever it may be, you can start to incorporate that into your access, right? And again, if somebody calls up, this is also a place where this happens all the time. If somebody on the finance team will call with an emergency to the security administrator on the Dynamics side and say, you need to give Homer Simpson access to customers right now. And if I'm an IT person, the one thing I could do is say, okay, I just want to close your ticket. I'll just give him whatever access you told me to. Now, the risk of doing that is somewhere down the line, you're going to have this mess of security, right? You've overgranted security because it's reactionary. Now, if you've defined it based on business process, you can say, I'm not sure I understand, where are we changing the business process that now that all of our AP clerks need access to customers? Or is it just this temporary thing? So when do you want me to revoke that access? Does he need it because he's covering somebody's desk for maternity leave? Is it seasonal help? Why are we doing this and you can start to push back a little bit. Because when you are if you are under some sort of, well, I mean, just from a risk perspective, not even if you're compelled to do it by regulatory compliance, if I'm an IT administrator or anybody at the organization, we shouldn't just be giving access to people just because somebody said so. There should be a good business case for requesting other access, or we need to say, maybe our security model's broken and we need to take another look at that. So it can help on building end-user security. It can help on assigning end-user security and then pushing back so you don't end up with somebody just this wild, wild west of mangled security. If you invest the time up front to get it right, it should really not be something where somebody calls with, you know, their hair on fire again to request that access. And then, the obvious use is documentation. So internally, it helps you document the systems, document the roles, document success. How do we do things on a successful basis so we can all go at home on time, right? Just that documentation to help those end users. And then it also helps you supplement your audit narratives, right? So how do we explain to the auditors, easily explain to the auditors, not only how we do things, why we do things, but where our risks are as we go through that, and then potentially what are our processes around that. So as an organization, if you say, well, here's our procure to pay process, and these are where we see our risks in that process, you can start to say, well, we use three-way match, we use workflows here, we use sign-offs, we do all these different things, but then you can also say, yeah, we use workflow, but we review the workflow on a monthly basis to make sure that it's still enabled. We review it to make sure that somebody's not approving their own transactions. Those types of things, if you incorporate those, that's going to be hugely helpful in a number of ways. One, it's going to be easier for you to perform those reviews and help communicate that risk out to the organization. But two, it helps you educate your auditors on why you think something is high risk at your organization, right? So it helps you be proactive with the auditors, right? Saying, we went through all these processes, we understand our risks, and this is why we're focusing on the areas we focus on, instead of saying, letting the auditor, the junior auditor who's a year out of school, come in and say, well, this is our audit program. We do this for all of our clients no matter what. So I want to see your sales process inside of Dynamics. And you say, we only use Dynamics for GL and AP. You know your business better than the auditors do, hopefully. So being able to take that documentation and walk them through it as well from a risk perspective is going to help them tremendously in terms of learning your business and learning what your risk profile is and how you identified that. So it's something that now more and more auditors want that, as opposed to the Word documents, the narratives. It's a great supplement for those. So how important is it to document your process? And I don't know how well this comes across online. But this is actually the process flow for how Maker's Mark makes their bourbon. And so obviously every single step along the way can influence the taste of the bourbon. And the only thing that Maker's Mark has is that, how their bourbon tastes. Does it taste the same way each and every time? Is it reliable taste that I know that when I take one of those red wax bottles off the shelf and open it, it's going to taste the way I want it to taste, right? And I'm getting thirsty. It must be close to noon, 5. We'll call it 5 p.m. But so they wanted to document, how do we do this? It's got to be the same way every time, because that's our brand equity, is that taste. So this is what they did. They documented their process flow of how they take water and turn it into the wonderful brown liquid that is bourbon, right? So this was written, if you can see there down at the bottom, it says approved April 13th, 1954, right? And so they've been doing it this way for a long time, and I took this picture when we were down at the distillery, and it's very important to them. And they have it documented to make sure that in the 50s, 60s, and when we get to 2020, it's going to taste the same way, but it hasn't always been the exact same person every single time they make that whiskey, right? So essentially, what they want to make sure it is, because it's not going to be the same person, somebody should be able to understand that very quickly and replicate that. So this is important to them, and in your processes should be the same. I mean, I don't know if finance month-end close is really as sexy as making whiskey, not to me at least, but it's at least important to the people that want to go home at night and not spend 3 weeks closing the month working 80 hours a week and having to work over the weekend. Right. So again, building these documents and referring to them is hugely valuable. So I thought this was fun as we were touring the distillery that they had that out there. So let's talk a little bit, if I can get the, there we go. So how are you going to do this? Right. So let's say, you know what, fine, you sold me. These are all great ideas. Let's say that I want to come back after lunch today and start working on one of these. The first thing that I would do is start with a high-risk business process, right? Or start with something that's important at your company. And I think one of the examples was one of our clients, they were having a very difficult time with their returns processing. So what was happening is they'd ship an order out to a customer, and their business process allowed customers to return unused quantities to them. Well, what was happening is they would just have box of products show up on their dock with no documentation. There was no label inside. There was nothing anywhere. It was just, here's this box full of our product, and they had no way to track it back. And so it was kind of that they needed to improve that process. So it was it was the one they were having a challenge with, and it was also a very high-risk thing because we don't want people returning product that shouldn't be returning product, right? And understanding where it's a high value process as well because it was dealing with so much product. So start with a process, sit down and think about all the processes at your organization. Is it procure to pay? Is it month-end close? Or it could just be something where you know that you could have a quick win. I would also recommend that you pick something that's an achievable science. Right, don't pick something that's so complicated that you're never going to get it finished. Because this first one, what we really want to do is we want to make sure that it's kind of a practice session to get everybody on the same page as to this is how we're going to do it. If you've never done it before, it's going to be a new experience for a lot of people. So maybe you only want to pick, you're not going to know how many steps are in your process before you start, but maybe it's just hire a new employee. A lot of, when you go through these classes, a lot of people end up saying, how do you get ready for work in the morning? Right? Okay, so I put on my pants and then my shoes, whatever it may be. But you start with something simple, but you may as well get some benefit for the organization by working on one of your own internal processes. So maybe it's hire a new employee. Include the business process owners and transaction level employees. And what I mean by that is, you hear the concept of, bring in the super user. Well, sometimes you'll bring in the AP manager as the super user, and it's really the AP clerks are like, yeah, I know that's how we're supposed to do things, but really the way things get done around here is like this. Yeah, we'd stopped doing those TPS reports a long time ago. So there's the way everybody thinks it's being done, and then there's the way it's actually being done, right? But part of that is you have to create a safe environment for people to speak their mind, right? We're all on the same page here. We're all on the same team. This isn't a performance review for anybody. We want to know what's actually going on at the organization, right? We don't want to know what's supposed to be happening. We want to know what's happening right now, right? So you're going to do a current state process flow. This is what happens all the time. And then what you also want to do is invite business process owners from related areas, right? In my example earlier with that credit card access database sitting around, if we wouldn't have invited the IT and the development team, nobody would have ever heard of that. That employee would have thought he was doing a great job, even though he was creating a whole lot of risk, right? So maybe it is, if there's a handoff between the sales team and the finance team, make sure that you have both of those teams involved. If there's a handoff between IT, if there's something that goes to the legal department, whatever it may be, make sure you invite somebody from those departments because they have visibility into certain things that you may not have visibility into. So not only you're inviting business process owners, transaction level employees, and related areas. There is a point of diminishing return with how many people you invite. There's no magic number, but you have to try to understand it's like, well, if we only need the finance person here for one step, maybe only invite them in when you get to that part, right? You don't want somebody sitting around for a 3-hour meeting that only needs to be there for 10 minutes. You also run the risk of people like to interject into the conversation. It kind of derails the conversation. So you want to make sure it's somewhat of an art as much as it's science, but you want to make sure that you have representation from those different areas. Part of that, derailing a conversation, is assign somebody to facilitate the meeting. Now, you can hire a professional facilitator. You can go hire, the Big Four. You can go hire somebody from there. There are people that this is all they do is business process mapping, certifications, all that kind of fun stuff. But the facilitator's role is really to try to use that Socratic method, ask a lot of questions, lead people down the path of how does this work, challenge them about decisions to kind of drive the discussion, but you're also trying to put some guardrails on the discussion so you don't get too granular, and that is kind of an art. That's why it's a specific profession, but my opinion is it's also something that you can learn, right? It's just kind of a feel thing, is maybe we're getting too far off here, or maybe we need to focus on getting it the first version of the process done and then iterating through it a few times to get that refined. But it's important that you have somebody that's a facilitator that's not a key member of the process if possible, right? If you're doing month-end close, you don't want your controller to be the facilitator. They should be a participant, not guiding and driving the conversation in their own direction, and you also want them to focus on improvements, not to make sure that Homer isn't disrupting the meeting, right? And then you also want to assign a scribe for the meeting. Who's going to be taking the notes? And again, they should not be ideally, right? You may not have enough people to do this, but ideally it should not be somebody that is part of the process. Because again, you want them to be interacting and providing the information and contributing, not just standing up there writing notes, because it is a time-consuming job to write the notes. So you either do, you turn that person into a futon, both the facilitator and the scribe, if they're involved in the process. They're going to be a bad facilitator and a bad contributor, or they're going to be a bad scribe and a bad contributor. So you want them to be one or the other, right? So don't ask them to do both. I don't like sleeping on futons. You might have picked up on that. Right, a futon is a bad couch and a bad bed. It's not, right, a good one or the other typically. So agree on the level of detail to be displayed, right? So understand as a group, this is what we're trying to get to in this meeting, this iteration, this is what we're trying to get to. So maybe that first time you go through it, all we're trying to do is get the steps, and then we'll incorporate the systems next time, right? That's what we're trying to do. Eventually, the end product has the roles, the systems, the risks, the steps, all of that. But maybe that first time, all it is the steps. And then pick a methodology. There are several. If you go out and Google methodologies, like what shapes are you going to use, and what kind of diagrams are you going to do? Top, down, are you going to do swim lane? What are you going to do? It doesn't matter. What matters is you pick something and you agree to it, and that's what you're going to use going forward. So you want to standardize that, go out, research it. Maybe somebody's already done a few at the organization. If that works for your team, pick that methodology, standardize, and that's how you're going to do it again and again. Because what you're really trying to do is build the workshop. The workshops is a repeatable process as well. So maybe if you've identified these are the 10 key processes we want to map, you want all 10 maps to look the same, improve your process over time, right? So these are a lot of the common business processes at a high level, right? So cash flow projections, payroll, or the HR side of it, compliance. As you kind of work through, these are all the things that businesses do. And then you can kind of drill down further into that. So sub-processes associated with HR and payroll, right? How do we hire somebody? How do we terminate somebody? What if somebody has a life event, right? What if we need somebody that has the distribution of payroll, that we have some people that like direct deposit and other people still want a manual check. Whatever it may be, how does that process vary, or how does that influence our process, right? So as you go through, again, you're not going to pick a process as big as say, let's do, the HR process cycle. Really what the process would be is, let's hire a new employee, right? So you want to get to that level of granularity in terms of, and then you have to make a decision, well, hiring a new employee, are we talking about HR or IT? Is that the same thing? But, you can get yourself spun into a pretty, trying to figure out what you're going to do. But typically at this level, it's the how do we bring somebody in? How do we take a customer, adding a new customer to the system or entering a sales order? Whatever level makes the most sense for your organization, or like the company I talked about, the RMA process, it's just this one piece of this process that we really need to focus on right now because that's what's giving us the challenge. So the tools of the trade, so typically what we do is take a roll of butcher paper, roll it out along the wall, take the printer's tape from Lowe's, the blue stuff, put it on the wall. Don't use duct tape. Don't use packing tape because the odds of you ripping the paint off the wall in the office or the wallpaper or the vinyl or whatever it is on the wall is fairly high. You do that about once as a new consultant at E&Y when you're right out of college, and then people don't really like that a whole lot. I learned that lesson really early on. So again, I put it up there on purpose because people are like, oh yeah, I'll use whatever tape I find around. So you just tape that up there. You're going to use Post-it notes. And so for every step, you write that down on a Post-it note and use markers. You're also going to want to use pencil. So when you write down one of the steps, right, that it's a customer places order, write it down in pencil, and then draw your lines in the process flow in pencil as well. Why? Things are going to change. And you don't want to, if you write it in ink, then you're going to have to write a whole new Post-it note. If you write it in ink with the process step, with the flow, the arrows, it's much easier to erase it than it is to scribble it out. So always use the pencil. Erasers, again, things change. People are going to be wrong. You're going to want to be able to erase things. And then Scotch tape. And I'll explain the Scotch tape here in a second. But always remember Scotch tape. So again, Scotch tape. Everybody know what Scotch tape is? There you go. So typically what we use are the swim lane diagrams. So what it is that as you go across in a linear fashion, every roll goes down. So lane 1 would be your sales person. Lane 2 is your AR clerk. Lane 3 might be a warehouse clerk. Lane 4 is UPS. Lane 5, and then as you go down, you can start incorporating the systems. So at the top are your roles, right? The people, that role, the salesperson. And then as you go down, you might have Microsoft Dynamics, and then you have Microsoft Dynamics CRM, and you might have UPS, your UPS system, and you might have other systems that you interact with as you go through. So as you go top down, those would be all your roles. So that's what you call that swim lane diagram. You can also use top down. People use, like you saw the Maker's Mark one. That's not a swim lane diagram. There are different ways to do it. Typically, I like to use the swim lanes. That's also how the LCS product for Dynamics works as well. So the symbols used in the process map, a role is a rectangle, an activity or a step, right? So the salesperson takes the order from the customer. So the salesperson is in that top box, takes the order from the customer as another box. The decision is this a drop ship order, yes or no? Right, so the diamond is anything where there's a yes or no question being asked. So if it says yes, you keep moving down the swimming pool, right? You keep moving in a linear fashion to the right. If it's a no, it drops down and it goes to the next step if the answer is no. And then a system is a cylinder, right? So it could be Dynamics, your HR system, maybe use Workday, or Active Directory, right? So during the new hire process, I need to enter this person into Dynamics 365. I need to enter them into Workday, Active Directory, Coupa, and a bunch of other stuff. So those are all your systems. So what you want to do is once you have all those pieces of paper, and the reason you use the Post-it notes is because Post-it notes are easily turned into rectangles, and then you can turn them 90 degrees, and now they become diamonds, right? So once you put all those out and have them going in a linear fashion down your pool, right, in your swim lanes, and you have everything written out and you like it, that's when you use the Scotch tape to tape down every single one of those Post-it notes to that piece of butcher paper. And the reason for that is when you take it down off the wall and roll it up, if you do that without the Scotch tape, all the Post-it notes will fall off the butcher paper and your process is toast. So make sure once you've done everything to preserve it. A lot of other people take pictures. I still would rather have it taped up there because you're going to roll those out. And I still have copies of ones that I did at certain clients back when I was doing SAP implementations in 1997 because I like to pull them back out so you can see, hey, this is a new hire process. This is how somebody else did that, and you can move some of those around. I like to keep souvenirs from projects I worked on too, but it's helpful to keep those around if you want to revisit those processes. So this is what it looks like inside of Visio, right? So you have a customer, a salesperson, order processing, customer support, Microsoft Dynamics, you have order admin, order processing, your CRM tool, and so the customer places the order. Is this a web order? No. Enter the order form into CRM. It drops into CRM. A lot of other processes happen, and then it goes into your order admin system for approval. And then as you go through here, this process is way longer than this, but just so it was hard enough to read anyway, maybe it just keeps going on as long as it needs to go on. So there are some rules of thumb that people say, well, as soon as you get to so many steps, that's actually a different business process. I have a tough time with that. I think a process is what a process is, and again, it's a feel thing. If you're talking about how does a customer place a web order at our organization from the time they place the order till the time the product is shipped, that's the process that we want to talk about. Or how does the returns process work? That's the process we want to talk about. So I don't like to limit it to, oh, you should only have 30 boxes, and once you go over 30 boxes, now that's a different process. I think those rules are too hard and fast, and it's as much as an art as it is a science. And so if there's a certified business process mapping person on, I apologize for that. That's just my own personal opinion. So really, that's the end goal, is to have those out there. So I know that I'm real close to the time. I apologize. Any questions? Jason, do we have any questions out there? Happy to answer anything. Or if my email, you can follow me on Twitter, or email me any questions at any time. Or if you want a copy of some of these in Visio that you can work from, I'm happy to send you some sample business processes that you can look at.
Yeah, so please enter any questions you have now in the Q&A block, and we can get to them. Well, so far, a pretty quiet audience here. I just want to remind folks of a couple things before we take off here. We have a quick survey that'll pop up. We do appreciate your feedback on today's event. Let us on our side, as well as Andy and the Fastpath team, know what you thought of today's content. We would appreciate that. And we'll be following up with information on the recording quite soon as well. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions here, Andy, so I think we can wrap up. People obviously do have your contact information.
Great, Jason.
So thanks for taking the time, Andy.
It.
Yeah, and thanks for the attention of everyone in the audience today. Glad you made it. And as always, we will be back. We have more GRC Day events coming up in the near future, so please stay tuned for those. With that, I think we will wrap up today's event. Have a great day, everybody.